Debating Metalheads. We're back for another exciting episode of Debating Metal. Once again, I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, and as always, my co-host is Chris Kaye. On this episode of Debating Metal, and in honor of Wrestlemania Weekend, we're talking about rock and wrestling, specifically how the worlds of metal and pro wrestling have been intertwined for decades.
A wrestler's theme song can be one of the most important aspects of introducing them to an audience. From the simple strums of the Fabulous Freebirds' Freebird to the extreme metal of the House of Black's Deadbody, wrestling themes set the stage for what you're about to see. Hard rock and metal have been linked with wrestling for decades, and today we're going to discuss how the mega powers of wrestling and metal explode.
And in the end of it all, we're going to give you our big 4 metal wrestling theme songs. So sit back, relax, turn it up to 11, and let the debate begin. Chris, metal wrestling theme songs. We're finally getting to it.
Well, I mean, we're both big metal fans, obviously, but we're both big wrestling fans.
Yes, we're both big wrestling fans. You're on your side, and I'm on my side.
I'm a little bit WWE. You're a little bit AEW.
I'm a lot of bit AEW. But you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I follow some of the stuff that's going on in WWE. You follow some of the stuff that's going on the AEW. Neither one of us follow shit about TNA.
From time to time over the years, I got into TNA. I mean, I was a wrestling fan since I've been a small child, probably about 3-4 years old. My grandpa got me into wrestling. I watched Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, the Mega Powers. I've been watching since then. I mean, off and on, there's been a few times when it's been really bad, where I've dropped out, but I've never stopped paying attention. It's always been something that's been in my life, and it's one of the big things that got me into a lot of the bands I like even. So, how'd you get into wrestling?
In fact, I'm very similar. I wasn't as young as you were, but I was still young. I mean, I was probably 10 years old or something like that. And one day my grandfather turned on wrestling. We had just gotten cable or something like that. My grandfather turned on wrestling, Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS. It was even before it was at 6:05. I mean, it was just at 6 o'clock. And I think what he turned on, Tommy Wildfire Rich had just come back from something. He had some sob story because he had like lost every match in his first year or something like that. And, you know, he gets beat up by the Freebirds or some bullshit like that. And I was freaking hooked. I'll tell you that. And I became a wrestling fan. I watched everything back in the day. I watched, you know, at the time it was NWA Wrestling, Georgia Championship Wrestling. They didn't have a lot of the, like, because I was watching TBS, I only got to see the Georgia stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't see Mid-South. I didn't see a lot of the, Florida stuff because I wasn't in Florida. I was in New York at the time. But I did see WWF at the time. There was a lot of that going on. And that was like pre, Vince McMahon Jr. owning the WWE now.
Same company,
Yeah, same company. So it was his dad who still owned it. He was slowly, working his way up the thing. I mean, he was an announcer, for God's sake. A bad one at that, over the top. Not bad. He wasn't bad. He was just very
unbelievable.
So, but
no, he was never a great announcer. I mean, there were certain things like he would lead the crowd in a certain direction, but he was never really a great announcer. Most of the time, he'd say, "What a maneuver!" Like not very good.
Yeah, I mean, it was very very early acting sounding, like the old actors from the 30s and 40s. They would always have a certain way of speaking, and he spoke like that. But eventually he changed his ways and whatever.
Not to mention really changing his ways today.
Oh yeah, no. But I used to watch all that shit, and I remember one day I got really excited because my grandmother was coming back from Puerto Rico, and I remember getting up early, and uh, TBS had a morning show. I think it was at 10 o'clock in the morning for an hour. Then at 12 o'clock, like Channel 11 or Channel 5 or something like that, one of those channels had a WWF on for an hour.
Hmm.
Then I think there was one at 2 o'clock. I'm not sure, but then the 6 o'clock one was for 2 hours, and then all of a sudden WWF was having a special event. I think at 10 o'clock at night on Saturday. So I was like, man, wrestling all. It's like I added it all up. It was like 8 hours of wrestling. I was like, yes, you know.
It's not far off today now.
I know now.
I mean,
Today's
especially with WrestleMania coming up.
just two or three episodes period. You're already 8 hours deep, you know. So yeah, I used to love that stuff. I remember that some of the earliest WWE stuff, or WWF, was Sergeant Slaughter had a challenge that you couldn't break the Cobra Clutch,
Hmm. Yeah.
and the person who tried to break the Cobra Clutch was Pat Patterson, and Pat Patterson broke it, and they when he tried to challenge Sergeant Slaughter about it, Sergeant Slaughter said no, and then of course they had a melee, which eventually led to a fight at Madison Square Garden, which was the first time that I saw such a bloody fight happen. I mean, I remember Pat throwing. He did one of those things where you grab the guy by the legs and you flip him towards the ring corner, and it bypassed the corner buckle and went all the way to the post and split open Sergeant Slaughter's head. And man, so I've never seen someone bleed so much in my life. And I can't remember what year that was, but it was early 80s. And Sergeant Slaughter went in with his white tank top, and it was just red at the end of it. And Pat Patterson had cowboy boots that he was just digging into Sergeant Slaughter's head with. Pretty violent in the match, but I was loving it. I was hooked, man. I was hooked.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different versions of wrestling and what we view as wrestling, right? Like there's today's WWE where it's more a spectacle. It's mostly still PG and things that are good. More easy to access, right? Like it's very easily accessible. Whereas AEW is a great option for people who really love like the more exciting wrestling, not as much the heavy storytelling and that kind of stuff. So it's a good time to be a wrestling fan again, and it's exciting. So I'm glad to be talking about this today.
Yeah, let's get on with it. All right, so we're going to start with the origins of the theme song. I mean, 'cause it's not necessarily metal related, but there is a hard rock song or two in there. And it's funny because I was reading a little bit about the history, and it really does go way, way back,
Mm-hmm.
um, to the point where it's like I remember certain things, but looking at the history online, it was like, whoa, that was really long time ago, and who would have thought that? But what do you have where what story did you read about the beginning of wrestling theme music?
Well, I mean, even before the one that I'm going to bring up, there was wrestling theme music, but what really brought it into the kind of modern age of what we know of as the big rock star wrestlers was the Fabulous Freebirds with their song Freebird. There was music way before that, but there was just this perception change where wrestlers became rock stars, and that was around that time.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, when I first got in, started watching that Georgia Championship Wrestling, and that first match with Tommy Rich that I saw where they kicked his ass. It was, I remember the Freebirds coming out, to that intro, and for Freebird from Leonard Skinner, and it was like it didn't really like seem like it was off or odd to me because not everybody came to the ring with music, but it was not. It didn't seem like it was out of place to me.
Yeah.
So like it didn't really occur to me at the time that this was the beginning of the theme song thing. It was that was just what I saw because Freebirds came out and boom, they were playing Freebird.
Yeah.
So it made sense.
No, it absolutely does. I mean, so from what I understand, the way it kind of came about was so Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy became friends, and they were basically starting up their thing together, and they were trying to come up with some things to make them stand out. And one of the things was Terry Gordy was a big fan of the song Freebird, thought it would be perfect if they called themselves the Freebirds because of the song, and that was really where the genesis came from. And it was so different and interesting that when people saw it, it was like it was a big surprise, and it caught on. They became rock stars, and like I said, they it changed a lot of what the industry was doing. There was people that followed that, like the Fantastics and the Rock and Roll Express, and that were doing the same kind of things where they made these music videos that were basically mimicking the actual music videos that the bands were doing. And so like they were bringing in cars and women and things like that, and kind of making their own versions of these things. And we didn't have the internet back then, so it was easier to put this in front of somebody and say like, this is we're making this. But in reality, they were just ripping off, real artists. And what's funny is there's a story that I've heard about how the Fantastics were at a show and they were with Jim Cornette, and somebody came to Jim Cornette and said, "Hey, Dusty Hill is here at the show, and he wants to see the Fantastics after the show." And he's thinking, "Oh shit, they didn't license the music. They were just they used it, and that was how it was back then." And he think they're gonna get sued or something. It just turned out Dusty Hill was a big wrestling fan, just went in to meet him. He was more than happy they were using the song. So like it was a different time where the people were maybe a little bit less litigious. And I just thought that was just a fantastic story. No pun intended.
Yeah, I mean, I think back then, because a lot of it had to do with the territories and wrestling wasn't really televised much, these guys would come out to songs that they liked, and realistically, because there was no, there's no promotion, there was no way to really have that kind of thing spread other than via mail, I guess, letter. Somebody say, "Hey, dude," they wrote a letter to their pen pal, if you want to look at it that way, that this, the Freebirds were playing Freebird that night or whatever,
Yeah.
So it's really wild. And now that I think about it, the Tommy Rich incident, I remember. I don't know if it was that same day. It wasn't that same episode I saw, but later on, maybe a month or so, he was wearing a Judas Priest "Screaming for Vengeance" shirt. So that would say it's at least 1982.
Oh wow. Okay.
So that's kind of, so I was probably 13 if that's the case when I got into it. But hey, who cares? It was nice. I was still young. So yeah, the Freebirds, were one of the first ones to really use it all the time. But they didn't necessarily, obviously they weren't necessarily the first ones to use it or to use theme music. But they were the first ones that I really think it was something that was associated with them.
Yes.
More than like, if you go all the way back into the 30s, 40s, this guy, Lord Patrick Lansdowne, was one of the first ones to use music. He was English, and he used "God Save the Queen" here in the United States, and basically he was a big ass heel, right? And that was like perfect heel
dirty
music.
foreigner.
Exactly. But it's one person, and because he was such a big deal back then, he got to play music. Then Gorgeous George saw that and says, "Oh, okay, I'm going to use this." And since Gorgeous George was such a big name, he got "Pomp and Circumstance," which is basically now the presidential theme song. So, it's that's how early it was, and those are the kind of people that used it,
Pomp and Circumstance
Yeah.
is isn't that the graduation
It's
walk?
it's a graduation
But
song
that
too.
was what Macho Man used later as well.
Yes, Macho Man used it. It's graduation music, but and the president has used it too, or
Okay,
events use that as well.
gotcha.
Um, so yeah, Pomp and Circumstance, not metal, but but it's just one of those things. That's where it all began, way back then. You
Mhm.
know, so we're talking about rock music, Freebirds. And you said you brought up the Rock and Roll Express. They used Van Halen's Jump, right?
Yes. Which
And
look up on video or look up on YouTube their music video for it. It's great.
so and then the Fantastic with Sharp Dressman. So that was also you talking about. I think 1983 around there, somewhere 84.
Early 80s, yes.
Yeah, way early 80s. Now, another one that was really big, and we're talking about metal at this point, with the Road Warriors pulled out Iron Man. And I remember when that happened because man, the first time I saw the Road Warriors, holy shit. I mean, they were in spikes. So they were associated with the music that I was just getting into, like Judas Priest had spikes,
Mhm.
and I'm trying to think who else. Iron Maiden had spikes, and then all of a sudden I see the Road Warriors were like giant spikes. So like when I say giant, they're like fucking 9 inches. Fucking these giant ass 6 inch, 9 inch spikes on their football shoulder pads, and they would just go in and destroy whatever team they were going up against because Georgia Championship Wrestling was 2 hours of fucking squash matches.
Oh yeah, and it wasn't just that. It was they were what in the wrestling business they say shoot, meaning like
Hmm.
real. Like they were tough guys,
Oh yeah.
and they were rough in the ring. So,
Oh
um,
yeah.
so
They were.
you believed that they were tough guys, and that was something back then. Obviously, the perception of wrestling is different now, where we know, you know, I think people have always somewhat known that it's an act, right? Um, but back then it was more believable. And these guys coming down to the ring with Iron Man and just destroying anybody that came into the ring. It was like there was what they called the Road Warrior pop, which was like just that reaction that the crowd. It was like just absolute just noise coming from the audience.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So as time progressed, all these, slowly but surely, wrestlers began to use music as a way for them to come down to the ring. I remember, when WrestleMania, I guess it was WrestleMania 3 was the one with Cyndi Lauper, or was that the first one?
It wouldn't have been the first one, no. I want to say it's WrestleMania
I
3.
think it was 3, right? And that was really the first time that they had that big crossover between wrestling and music. Cyndi Lauper was huge at the time. And so, Hulk Hogan was an enormously huge wrestler, and
Oh
he
no, it
started.
was WrestleMania 1. It
Was it
was
WrestleMania one?
Yeah, because I was trying to remember which one she was with Wendy Richter, but it was
Right.
afterward that they did the Rock and Wrestling connection, and so yeah, it was WrestleMania 1. That it goes back that far.
Yeah. So and then Hulk Hogan coming out. I don't think he was doing Real American, but
No, I believe he had Eye of the Tiger at that point.
that was one of I Had a Tiger. It's just crazy how it just began to develop and then it just kind of exploded. But that handed to Vince McMahon again with obviously creating WrestleMania and then just bringing in all these outside influences, if you want to look at it that way, in terms of musicians, in terms of actors, in terms of other sports stars, in some cases, and crossing them over with wrestling. I mean, that's definitely one of his brainchilds.
Yeah, there was given like a few years into it, it almost became more important about the celebrities because it was like a way of like trying to legitimize the whole thing, right? Is
Right.
bring in celebrities, make it appear that it's not as much of a carny act and it's more of a legitimate thing. And so there was a time even where, they're doing crossovers with Baywatch and things like that, where it's less about, you know, the act of wrestling and more about the spectacle. And so, like, yeah, I mean, it's important, and it's become part of the meta of wrestling to have these themes and all this kind of things. But like, yeah, that's definitely where the genesis was, where, you know, the early guys, like the ones we mentioned, they started it, but then like things began to change as far as they weren't licensed. Like, as it became bigger, they weren't licensing songs. They were writing their own songs, and sometimes they were, making things that were inspired by other things, and so you had like artists that were brought in to specifically write songs, or even like in the case of Jimmy Hart, I think most people would know Jimmy Hart as, a pretty famous manager for, say, Hulk Hogan, Nasty Boys, etc. You know, I don't know how many guys Jimmy Hart managed, but it's hundreds, I would imagine. He wrote a lot of the early WWF songs. And then he would later go to WCW and write songs for them, often ripping off himself, which is kind of funny. And ripping off other artists, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, like things shifted, and you see a big gap of time where in the early days, in the territory days, they would pick a song and it was cool and it fit, and they didn't care about licensing and stuff like that, because most of the time it wasn't even on TV. They had TV shows, but they also, like, the biggest draw was the live show. That's where they really made the money. The TV was just to support the live show and get the people to go. Whereas now it's very different, where the sponsorship deals and that kind of stuff are really where they make their money. And so the music became more of a thing. Like, it was important, and there's some really cool ones, and we'll mention, songs over the years and stuff like that, and talk about some of the guys who wrote the music. But it became less of like using a pre-existing song and more of using something that was created for them so that it could stay in house. However, around the 2000s, that began to change again, where it became cool to use a licensed song or have a song that was written by the organization, but then have a band come in and play that was a famous band. So like there was cultural shifts that happened that kind of affected that.
Right. And it's evolved so much over the years. I mean, from having these quote unquote licensed songs, I think even at the beginning of that, obviously, we were talking about Iron Man, Freebird, Sharp Dressed Man. None of those were really, I don't think, licensed at first. But
yeah, that's what I was saying. They weren't licensed. They just like took them.
Right, exactly. And then eventually it was one of those things where, like, we're so popular, we have to license them. And, and there's a lot of really good songs, metal wise, that have been used over the years, that are, that are associated with certain wrestlers, and you talk about the biggest one right now, to me nowadays, the biggest one is Cult of Personality, that's associated with CM Punk.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before many times on the show because we're both fans of Living Color. Cult of Personality is an absolutely awesome song. CM Punk started using it in Ring of Honor. When he went to WWE, he went through, a couple different songs and then went back to Cult of Personality during one of his like biggest time periods, which was around the Pipe Bomb promo, which, if you're familiar with it, it's a major touchstone in the wrestling history. And then when he came back in AEW a few years ago, he came back with the Cult of Personality theme song. And then now recently, when he's returned to WWE again, still using this song, but a new version, which has been released, re-recorded by the band, which is really cool. So yeah, I mean, that one's a major one.
Oh yeah. I mean, what other major ones we're talking about? Kid Rock, American Badass for the Undertaker, Limp
And
Bizkit's
that
Roll.
was major because that was in the height of Kid Rock's popularity, and it was a huge thing because the Undertaker, had been gone for a while, been injured. They did that big ministry storyline and everything like that, and it was a way for him to refresh himself. He comes back in a new persona as his more like his real self, his biker kind of self, and he's the American badass, and it was a big boon for Kid Rock as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was. I mean, it applied itself so well to what the Undertaker was doing that I mean it was just like symbiotic between those
Yeah,
two. And then Undertaker moved on to Roland from the Biscuit.
yeah.
You
When the
know,
license ran out.
and then you got people like when Sting would come out, he came out to Seek and Destroy from Metallica. I mean that was pretty cool. I remember that, and it was one of those things where I was a huge Metallica fan, or still am, a huge Metallica fan. But I
That's
remember
because it
when that,
was.
yeah, I rem, I for whatever reason, it wasn't one of those things where when I heard that, like I would jump up and go, "Oh, here's Sting," right? It was just one of those things where like I just kind of, yeah, that's Metallica, and that's the way I felt about it. I kind of still do, you know. I know that Rob Van Dam used Walk when he was in ECW,
Yeah, he used the Kilgore version of it.
the Kilgore version. Yeah, and I mean that's a uh, man, that's a super cool ass entrance, and you got the crowd cheering Walk. You've got you know. I mean, the Dudley Boys use Bombshell from Power Man 5000. As cool of a song as it is, and as cool as Power Man 5000 is, but to me, they just came and went. you know, so
Um,
I I, I never
yeah,
got
but
into Power Man 5000.
like that theme song was big at the time. Because it was around that time, like I said, when bands started using, I mean, wrestlers started using songs from like real bands, and that was like pretty much at the height of Power Man 5000's popularity. But it wasn't even about the band. It was like that song was associated with them, and even when they went to TNA later, they used a song that was similar. So we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, and then talking about some real big ones that are well, not even that. Before one of the things that I used to like, so I didn't get out of it. I kind of grew out of wrestling or watching wrestling when I got married the first time in the early '90s, and or even into like when I moved to Florida. I watched it sometimes, but I started hanging out with friends on Saturday night, so I didn't get to watch a lot of it. So late 80s, early 90s, I wasn't doing much wrestling watching at all. And then middle 90s, I started I started having issues in my relationship, and I ended up, moving out, and I got back into my old house. My grandfather still watching wrestling all these years later, mid to late 90s. Now we're talking about, you know, the whole shift from where wrestlers started, basically leaving WWF and going to WCW. And one of the big ones obviously was Hulk Hogan, and he started using Voodoo Child from Jimi Hendrix. And it's like that's kind of the reason why I even know about that song. Because I wasn't so into Jimmy, and what I did know or like about Jimmy was really just the like Fire, uh, Foxy Lady, Purple Haze. I wasn't deep into his catalog because he was, I wasn't really a guitar player, and so I wasn't really into what Jimmy offered uh, modern guitar players at that time. So I didn't get deep into his music, but that song, every time I heard it, I'm like, hey, who is that? That's so cool, right? And then I found out it was Jimi Hendrix. I'm like, oh shit, let me go back listen to it. And now then finding out Stevie Ray Vaughan has a badass version of that song too. So that was super cool for me.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was a couple of years after he moved over to WCW, but it was a landmark thing. That was a big change because the NWO came around, and that
Right.
was his NWO theme song. And he was the only one in the NWO that had its own theme song too. Well, other than the Outsiders, yeah. But so just to go over a couple more before we move on to um, some songs that were made for wrestlers rather than pre-established songs. We've got Edge, who is now known as Adam Copeland, his real name in AEW. He had Never Gonna Stop by Rob Zombie. And then he had Metalingus, which he's still using now in AEW, by Alter Bridge. That was a really cool one. I remember when it showed up, and I'm glad he's still getting to use that one today.
He gets to use that because he's friends with Mark Tremonti, and he's like, "Hey, can I use that?" And Mark's like,
Right.
"Sure, go right ahead." And since Alter Bridge, one of the few bands out there that own their own music, says, "Go right ahead," And
Alter Bridge is also, I think, the only like regular artist, not like. Well, no, that's not true because I think Downstate also has like a song with AEW and with WWE. So there's a few.
Mhm.
But they're one of the artists that have a major song. They have the one for the what's their name, Judgment Day. They have that song as well. So
Who's Alter Bridge?
yeah, Alter Bridge has a song with the Judgment Day group.
Mm.
Excuse me, the Judgment Day group has their song. I can't remember what it's called. But so there's Ronda Rousey had Joan Jett, Bad Reputation. Jeff Hardy had Endeavor After's No More Words. That was never a major band, but one of the guys in the band, the lead singer, was part of what's that band? That L.A. Guns for a little while. John Moxley's currently using Wild Thing by X. House of Black is using Deadbody by Deadbody. We mentioned that in the intro. That's an extreme metal song. So never thought I'd get to see that on TV. Really,
Right, exactly.
Orange Cassidy's using Jane by Jefferson Starship.
I like that. I like that song when it's got that like little kind of quietish guitar intro, and then it just builds up to this drum slap, on the snare, and then everybody kicks in. I like his intro a lot. And to answer your question, the Alter Bridge song that you're talking about is called "The Other Side."
Yes, The Other Side. It's a good song. That one was around before the band started using it too. I mean, the wrestlers started using it too. And so to kind of finish things up, the Young Bucks are now using "Carry On Wayward Son," and then this isn't really a metal song, but Baltimore's Tarzan Boy, Jungle Jack Perry used to use that for a while.
It's an 80s song, which is so funny about that. I mean, it's like literally an 80s song.
Yeah, it was in two movies that I liked growing up, Beverly Hills Ninja and Ninja Turtles, coincidentally both ninja movies. And then Ruby Soho uses Ruby Soho by Rancid, which is why she's using that name right now. And last but not least, Chris Jericho is using his own band's song, Judas, which has been around before he ever used it as a wrestling theme. So
And it's funny about
technicality.
yes, but what's funny is that's not as simple as Alter Bridge. Yes, it's a Fozzy song, right? But Chris didn't write the song, so songwriting wise, I mean, they own the sync rights, but they don't own their music like Alter Bridge does. So they literally have to license it from the publisher, whereas Alter Bridge literally can give their own permission. So it's a weird thing. Even Chris Jericho has to license it from the publishing company. So there's a I guess an easier way about it because he can approve because they do the band itself does 50% of the publishing, and then there's the publishing company.
Yeah.
Whereas so at least he
I'm sure he's got some
it.
sway in the matter.
Yeah, but what's his face? Tony Khan still has to pay the publishing company a certain fee that's been negotiated. So it's funny because it's not as simple as Alter Bridge's version. simplicity.
Going right in hand with that. So, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the companies started using an in-house writer to write the songs. Now,
Mhm.
they still have to pay licensing to, or not licensing, but royalty fees to those guys that wrote those songs per their old contracts. So guys like Jimmy Hart, who, like I said, who did songs for WWF and WCW, Jim Johnston, who did a lot of music, important music for WWF. And I don't know how things are today, but Mikey Ruckus is the primary songwriter for AEW. And just knowing how Tony Khan writes contracts, he probably got a pretty good deal.
You know what's funny about Mikey Ruckus too is he doesn't get a lot of time to write these songs.
Oh
He's
yeah,
like he's told like he's get like 2-3 days. He's like, hey, by the way, someone's starting on Monday or Wednesday, or whatever. And he's like, oh, okay. And he has to go write a song and hope that the wrestler like likes it, you know, otherwise
well,
you gotta go make tweaks to it.
it's not a whole lot different for Jim Johnston who did WWF stuff because it was like they would put out a song and then they would do 14 versions of it until they got the right thing over time. So I was laughing because I was watching a video of like all the songs for Stone Cold Steve Austin, and there's this time period in 2001 he has like 17 songs because they're all slightly different versions of the same thing, but they're different enough and they're labeled all as different songs, like different titles, which is hilarious. So it's one of those things like they just didn't give him a lot of time. They had to work on the fly, and it's part of the nature of the business. So going right in hand with that, just gonna mention some songs that were made for wrestlers that are metal songs that are really kind of some of the more popular ones. And then we'll move on to uh, some WCW bollocks. So, so Demolition and Real American by Rick Derringer. I think a lot of people probably know those if they were fans of WWF in the '80s, especially Real American. That was Hulk Hogan's like, you know, most recognizable theme, I would say. You got voices for Randy Orton by Rev Theory, Downstate, which is Cody Rhodes' theme song when he was in AEW, and Kingdom by Downstate is Cody Rhodes' theme when he was in AEW, as well as now that he's in WWE, he's carried that theme song over. That one's a really popular one right now, whereas we're going to date this by saying, we're going to WrestleMania in 2024, the XL WrestleMania. And so, that hopefully we're going to see him finish his story. I'm hoping to see in a couple weeks if that's the case.
And I told you the joke about that is that George R. Martin's going to finish his Game of Thrones story before Cody finishes his.
So we also got Kenny Omega. He's got his Battle Cry theme song, and Little V did a version of that. Little V is internet popular musician. He's done tons and tons of songs. Check him out on YouTube. You got John Moxley's original theme song in AEW, Unscripted Violence by Violent Idols. That was a really cool one. I liked it much better than his Wild Thing.
I love that so much more than Wild Thing, especially and Wild Thing on top of that is by the old punk band X, and it's just not. I don't know.
It just doesn't fit him.
No, to me it doesn't fit him. This Unscripted Violence from Violent Idols is awesome, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, Violent Idols played that live at one of the pay-per-views.
Yes, they did.
So,
all right. So we got. One of the ones that I loved as a kid was the Unstable, the Ultimate Warriors theme song. That was a Jim Johnston one. And it was like one of those ones that just got you pumped when he's running to the ring and shaking the ropes. It was just really metal. I love that one. And then we got Bryan Danielson today with Born for Greatness by Elliot Taylor, Swerve Strickland's Big Pressure by Swerve the Realist, and Flash Garments.
I think so. I think that's his own song.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And then the one last group of songs I want to mention here is the Game, Evolution, and King of Kings, all by Motorhead and Jim Johnston, sorry. And those were all for Triple H, and they're all great tracks. So Those are some of the ones. I mean, there's probably about 30,000 more that you could mention. A lot of the stuff in the 2000s, there were songs that were already written, and then they did versions where they brought in artists to play them, and some of that's on some of the CDs we're going to mention later. But yeah, there's so many of them, and you can see like you had real artists come in and play a lot of these songs. So it became like even then you're starting to get a little bit of that trickling in. So so why don't we talk about, and I'd like you to kind of mention what was going on with this band at the time. But 1998, WCW brings in the Kiss Demon. So 1998, what's going on with Kiss?
1998, Kiss is in the middle of their reunion. So they reunited in 1996 and started their tour. I believe they had done Psycho Circus already, and they're back. They're a masked band again. I remember this whole demon debacle, if you want to call it that. I mean,
Psycho Circus would have come out probably just before this, like a month before.
I mean,
I think this was October and that was September, so just a bit before.
Right. And the crazy thing about it is that Kiss was popular. We're not going to, they regained their popularity because they decided to reform and then put the makeup back on and all that stuff. And so they're doing everything they can to get across every single platform to get their name out there. Look, in all honesty, not a bad idea. I mean, you can't blame Kiss for trying to connect in this way. The demon character is pretty awesome in the concept that they wanted to try, but I think the execution obviously was horrible.
Okay,
so you can elaborate a little bit more on that, but it was pretty bad.
I remember watching this. Is 1988. I'm watching Nitro, and they say they're going to have Kiss on, and Tony Schiavone says, "I've loved this band forever, and I'm so excited to see Kiss," and I'm just like, why? I wasn't a Kiss fan at the time. I'm like struggling to process this in my head, and they come on, they play God of Thunder, which is cool. Like it's one of their cooler songs for me at the time. And at the end, you see this guy walk out, and he's dressed as basically Gene Simmons. Right. And I'm looking at him, and I'm like, that guy looks familiar, but I couldn't put my finger on it. So I go to school the next day, and we're talking about, or maybe it wasn't even the next day, but it was not long after. We're talking about, who the Kiss Demon was. You're kind of laughing about it, and somebody says it's Crush, and that's Bryan Adams in WCW, and I'm like, there's no way it's Crush. Like, come on. And then we realize, like, somebody either videotaped it or something, and sure enough it was. But the reason why I couldn't believe it was for the longest time is because that was his only appearance as the Demon. He comes out later and it's a different guy. So I'm arguing with my friend, like, you're crazy, that's not him, And so, like, for the longest time, and then years later, I'm like, oh, like, okay, it is Bryan Adams, right? So, but this guy Dale Torborg is basically like a race car driver or something. Like, he didn't even have his own gimmick. He's wearing a WCW race car outfit, and that's like his whole thing. Like, that's all I had ever seen this guy before. Now he's the Kiss Demon, and then by the time there's tons of time goes by, like almost a whole year or two later, they finally have him kind of more established. He hasn't really done much of anything, hasn't been there. does a mid pay-per-view quote unquote main event. So you're watching a pay-per-view, you get it's Super Bowl 2000, and you get about halfway through the show and they say now for our special main event, and it's the fourth card on the mat, or fourth match on the card. And I'm like, what what is this? And they're doing the Demon Dale Torborg and against the wall. And so like how is this a main event? We're halfway through the show, or maybe not even halfway. And it was because they had a contract with Gene Simmons that said they had to have a main event. So they're way out of it because Eric Bischoff saw this thing was tanking real fast, was to just mid pay-per-view call it a main event. And legally, it was a special main event. So they got away with it. And then afterwards, they kind of teamed him up with Vampiro and the Insane Cloud Posse. They had a group called the Dark Carnival. And then it just disappeared. And it didn't really hurt Kiss, but it definitely hurt WCW.
Yeah, you know, it was done. It was just done wrong. You got a guy. I mean, it's like you can't just introduce a wrestler and expect the guy to be a main event draw. Okay, that gets built up over years. Okay, you can. I mean, not even Goldberg was a main eventer right off the bat. You know, they built him up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so you can't expect this to take off. You know, right away. I mean,
I don't think WCW thought it was going to take off to the degree that Gene Simmons did.
Well, I mean, you tell Gene Simmons, he's such a. If he sees a dollar sign, there's two things that will blind the guy completely: tits in his face or dollars in his face. One of the two. Okay, and the guy becomes completely useless, right? And that's why you have to have lawyers and smart people around. As much as a shrewd businessman he may or may not be, okay. There's just sometimes where he gets in his own way because thinking things are going to be huge, but doesn't really understand the concepts behind them. Anyhow, bottom line is that you can't just take a person who may or may not be an average wrestler and make him a superstar just because he's hiding behind a mask.
Average isn't even. That's too nice.
Well, it's too nice, but he
Dale Tor. They even called him on the paper the Demon Dale Torborg. Like
right.
That's awful.
I mean, but whose fault is that? That's WCW's fault.
They were trying to tank it at that point. They were like, let's just get rid of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, if it could have been done right and it could have been successful, if they would have, had a guy that, they could have, sort of like how Ole Anderson said, yeah, we could have got any of these big guys from the gym. Well, get one. All right. WCW could have gotten some super athlete, big guy. I mean, Dale Torborg's not a small dude, and he wasn't bad looking in terms of his physical body, right? But you got to have someone who can wrestle.
Yeah.
Get a big wrestler, right? And sit there and say, okay, we need you to do this. And then, and if you build it up properly, because obviously he needs to wrestle, the Road Warriors were good wrestlers, but all they did was kick the shit out of people at first, right? But they still had decent wrestling maneuvers. I mean, but they were enormous people. So you get somebody like that and you just turn him into this demon guy and you just slowly build it up. But they couldn't because contractually they had to have this guy in the main event, right off the bat. And that was bullshit, So that's where they went wrong.
I don't know if this ever would have been right, but they certainly, were kind of snake bitten from the beginning.
Yeah, they were.
All right, so let's talk about some legally distinct theme songs. So let's kind of preface this. You had wrestlers that were in one organization and would go to another organization, and sometimes they would rip the song off that the guy had in the previous company. And then there were other instances where they were just popular music at the time. And Jimmy Hart specifically was notorious for this. Would take a song and just make it different enough to be legally distinct. So you had like, say, one of my favorite examples is you have DDP with Self High Five, and it was ripping off "Smells Like Teen Spirit" by Nirvana. So you have "Smells Like Teen Spirit," which is dun 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 dun, right, and then DDP's was dun 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 dun. So it's just ever so slightly different enough, to pass for legally a different song. It's the same shit. So WCW was notorious for this. They had, Hulk Hogan's Real American was ripped off into American Made. They're different enough songs where it's not as egregious as what I just mentioned, but it's the same thing. And you know what? Like, it's fine because it was like Hulk Hogan's thing was being a real American, right? So American Made, fine. The one of the worst ones to me was there was the Ultimate Warrior in WWF, and he goes or he leaves the company. Obviously Hulk Hogan goes to the WCW, and they talk about like possibly bringing in the Ultimate Warrior, and instead they talk about the Ultimate Surprise, and they've got this like guy standing in the back of a promo, and there's like steam, blocking the view, and you can't really see who it is, but you're like, oh my god, the Ultimate Surprise! This guy looks like the Ultimate Warrior. It's clearly the Ultimate Warrior, and they bring out the next week this guy he was a former stripper that just happened to be on roids, and he was the Renegade, and it was very obvious to the crowd very quickly that this was not the Ultimate Warrior. And so it was basically, the same kind of theme song. He would go out and run the ropes and shake them, and it was ridiculous. So that to me was like the epitome of these rip-offs, because it wasn't just a rip-off song; it was a rip-off guy.
My time of watching the WCW in the late 90s and early 2000s, or until it got sold, it was even I didn't see a lot at all between like 1990 all the way up to 96, and those were the really lean years of WCW, World Championship Wrestling. And then, when Eric Bischoff took over and shit changed, it got better, and then it got worse. and when it got bad, it got bad.
Oh
and
yeah.
So, guys like, Renegade, that would, it was so sad, because it's almost sort of like, when Vince tried to do, a different, Diesel.
Oh, fake Diesel and fake
Yeah,
Ramon.
exactly.
Oh, horrible.
I
I
mean,
still own the character, so I'm gonna that's what matters. No, no. The actual guy is what matters, not the character.
uh, hey,
Oh, so
someone needs to
bad.
tell that to Paul and Gene. Okay, just saying.
Um,
So,
so a few more. Bret Hart, they ripped off his Heart Attack theme with Hitman in the all right, sorry. Yeah, with Hitman in the House. That was the name of it. It was bad. It kind of sounded like the vocal box thing that uh like Bon Jovi uses and
yeah, the
Vox or whatever it's called.
yeah,
Yeah.
the
The
thing
one of
that
the
Peter Frampton uses.
yeah that notoriously uses. Um, so Road Dogg, this one was bad because his own brother was playing a character that called Buzzkill, that was basically the Road Dogg, and they had a rip-off version of the New Age Outlaws theme for him, like his own brother. That's messed up. So a couple of the most popular ones were Raven and Chris Jericho. Raven had a version of "Come as You Are," and what was so funny about it too is it had just kind of like a different pace to it, and then where it goes dun 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 dun. It was dun 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 instead. So it was just like ever so slightly different. And then Chris Jericho was known to hate his theme song. He had a ripoff of Even Flow. So we did an episode a while back about grunge. This was definitely tailing off of the grunge era. Rick Steiner, you said you listened to this one today. Welcome to the Dog Pound. Guess what that one's a ripoff of?
I listened to it, right? And I'm like, at first I said, no, this isn't the same as Welcome to the Jungle. And then you hear the riff, right?
It's like it's the same. I don't know how they got away with this one.
Well, because I think
the lyrics are different.
Well, lyrics are different, but what was funny about it is that I think Rick Steiner's version was they used the same main riff over and over and over and over and over again.
Yes.
So they didn't have like a bridge, or they didn't have any sort of like, change in key or anything, whatever the Welcome to the Jungle has, right? And then they used the same lick. And whatever Slash does between, like, I only think he does it like once or twice, right? This was every fourth measure. They were hitting the same stupid little fucking lick that Slash does. And I'm like, this is horrible.
Yeah. It's so funny too, because when we watched this back in the day, I was like, how are they getting away with this? And come to find out, like when they do the checks, they're looking for like the notes on the page if they're the same. So you can have like the same melody just as long as the notes are different and get away with it. It's crazy.
To some degree.
So Perry Saturn had a ripoff of Judas Priest, You Got Another Thing Coming, and then later he had one of The Beautiful People by Marilyn Manson. Jeff Jarrett had a ripoff of Cowboy by Kid Rock with The Chosen One. This one was bad. Vince Russo had an Iron Man theme, and it was Iron Man until it got like 2 minutes into the song. Then it changed. It is bad. And of all people to have Iron Man, Vince Russo ain't it.
No, not at all. Not at all, bro.
Not at all, bro. Bro, what you doing, bro?
Bro. Fucking guy needs to get slapped with a bro.
So a couple more for WCW. Wrath. That was Adam Bomb and WWE, WWF, sorry. And he had a version of Running with the Devil from Van Halen. VK Wall Street, you probably know him better as IRS. He had a Love in an Elevator. Why? Of all people, Love in an Elevator for that dude. I'm sorry, no.
So you said VK Wall Street, better known as IRS. I know him as Mike Rotunda, his real name, because that's what he wrestled with in WCW originally.
Yes. So Jerry Flynn, he not Jerry Lynn, but Jerry Flynn, had a version of Peace of Mind from Boston. And Shane Douglas had a version of Perfect Strangers with the Perfect Franchise. That one's not even like masking itself. That's a Deep Purple song.
These guys were not, they weren't very discreet.
No. So going over to the WWF, you had, say, Razor Ramon, who had Bad Boy, which if you listen to Those Shoes from the Eagles, it's very close. It's not really a metal song, but, rock music. You got Ken Shamrock later on, had Dangerous, and that was a ripoff of Money for Nothing. A little bit, not 100%, not a ripoff. Most of the WWF ones are, I would say, more inspired by. not as egregious as some of the WCW stuff that we mentioned earlier. Especially like Staying Alive by the Bee Gees, Dude Love had the Dude Stir. That's more inspired by, right? But in later times, Tommy Dreamer, famous from ECW, had a version of Man in the Box. That one's a pretty bad ripoff. Okay, so Stevie Richards had a version of the Chronic theme, which was a very metal song that Hart and Helm wrote. So Hart and Helm is Jimmy Hart with his writing partner. So you have the WWF ripping off WCW now in return. And then Drew McIntyre going to be wrestling for the WWF championship, or sorry, WWE championship this weekend, or yeah, this weekend, right? Because we're posting it right ahead.
Yeah,
this weekend at WrestleMania had a song called "Broken Dreams," which was very clearly inspired by Metallica's version of "Turn the Page." Did you listen to that one?
no, I haven't gotten a chance to listen to that one yet.
Okay, definitely listen to it and then get back to me and let me know what you think, because you'll be like, okay, this isn't the same song, and then it gets to a part you go, oh, okay, I get it now. Ted DiBiase Jr. had a version of Money called $1 Million Baby from Pink Floyd. And then Chuck Palumbo had a pretty clear ripoff of Sad But True by Metallica. And then Jack Thwagger had a song called Get on Your Knees, which was a very obviously a rip of Testify by Rage Against the Machine.
Fun of his list for?
What are you talking about? One last one that I want to mention from WWF is this one's really funny. So if you go back and watch the WCW release, what do you call it? Like the streaming on the Peacock or the WWE Network, it's funny. They have to overdub some of the old WCW themes that, like the ones we mentioned with Raven, they just put his WWF theme song on there. With Chris Jericho, they did the same thing. So it just plays the Break the Walls Down. And then with DDP, they did a ripoff of a ripoff. So there is a Come As You Are, as a Smells Like Teen Spirit ripoff that's Self High Five, and then they did a ripoff of Self High Five. So it's a ripoff of a ripoff.
Nice.
And couple quick ones for ECW and then TNA. So Taz had a ripoff of War Machine by Kiss, so Kiss again. That was called Path of Rage. That one's actually really cool. I like that one. And then 3 from TNA. So this one, we mentioned the Dudley Boys earlier with their Bombshell theme song. So the beginning says, get up, get up, get up, watch, or get up, get up, get up, watch the bombshell. Yeah, right. So get up, watch the bombshell. Their theme song when they were Team 3D and TNA was watch out, watch out, watch out. There's a bombshell. It's like the same thing. Scott Hall had a ripoff of his own theme song when he was Razor, as Marvelous Me. It's like the same song. And then Christian Cage, we had Takeover, which was actually a ripoff of My Last Breath from Evanescence.
Oh, okay.
That is the end of the ripoff portion of this. Let's talk about a couple albums that were released that were kind of more metal oriented. We're gonna skip over parts of them because don't need to go in extreme detail for this. But in 1998, ECW released Extreme Music. What was kind of cool about this was a lot of really popular music from the time, but they were songs that were re-recorded by different bands. So, you want to talk about that one?
Yeah. So It's funny you say we bring up this ECW one because I actually bought this. I was like, you know what? I'm a really big fan of metal, obviously, and I'm a really big fan of cover songs. And when you look at the list of names that are on this album, it's like, oh, these are, you're talking White Zombie, Kilgore doing Walk. You have Megadeth, Bruce Dickinson, Motorhead, Anthrax, Tres Diablos, which you've come to find out later is Pantera. Um, you
Intro
know,
without Phil.
without Phil, because there's no there's no words. They didn't need Phil that day. And Monster Magnet. So it's just a really good fucking album. Now are the cover versions good? They're okay. They're not bad. I mean, I'm a big fan of Anthrax, and the fact that Anthrax covered a Metallica song, I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, that
You know,
one's really cool. I like that. I like the Walk version by Kilgore.
yeah, the Walk one is good. So I was just like, I want to get this. I mean, I have it. I'm sitting here looking at it, and this is really, really cool. There's a song by Muscadine that's they do a cover of Big Balls from AC/DC, and it's by a guy named Balls Mahoney. Who knows who Balls Mahoney is?
He was Santa Claus in WWF.
But it's basically, this extreme wrestler. It looks a little bit like Mick Foley, but it's just some interesting shit on here. you know um
Yeah, I thought it
you
was really cool. I remember seeing the cover, it had Sandman on it, and I didn't know everything from ECW. Like I only watched what I could. We didn't have a lot of money and weren't always buying pay-per-views and everything, but anything that I could get my hands on wrestling at that time. And so I was in, I think it was Walmart or Target or something like that. It was on the shelf and we bought it. It was like $11 or something.
what's funny about it is like I wasn't a huge fan of ECW, not because I didn't like it and not because I wasn't watching wrestling, but because I couldn't get it. Like I didn't know what channel it was on. I didn't know when it played. And
Yeah, for a lot of people didn't.
right, exactly. Because a lot of times I think it played like at 2 a.m. So I wasn't really on top of the wrestlers, and then I ended up catching a couple of episodes one time, and I'm like, okay, so this is what this is all about. And of course, what did I see? I saw Sandman, I saw Taz, Lance Storm, Tommy Dreamer, and what's his name, Sabu. That was where I was like, yo, this is crazy shit. Which Sabu was one crazy motherfucker.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so yeah, I wasn't a huge fan at the time only because I didn't watch it. I couldn't watch it. Um, but whenever I got to see it, I did watch it and I thought it was pretty cool. So that's why I ended up buying the CD. And my CD's like brand new. I've only used it a couple times.
Go figure.
Well, I ripped it and then I now got the MP3s.
All right, so I'm going to mention WCW Mayhem, the music that was in 1999. But we're only going to talk about a couple tracks because, for the most part, it was like a half and half kind of thing. It had some just generic wrestling music, and then other kind of genres, some rap and some other stuff. But we're just going to talk about the metal portions of it. They had "Here Comes the Pain" by Slayer. Crush 'Em by Megadeth, which was supposed to be a Goldberg theme song, but I don't know if he ever used it. I mean, everybody knows the Goldberg theme song, it's pretty much always been the same. So if he did use this, it was brief. They had What Up Mach by Macho Man, or not by Macho Man, but it was Macho Man's rock theme song, metal theme song by Heart and Helm. And they had Blast by Kid Rock, Seek and Destroy Live by Metallica. That was, like you mentioned earlier, Sting used that theme song, even when he retired. And then they had a Limp Bizkit Every Last Song called Faith. It was a remix of that one. And then American Made, which you mentioned earlier. So that one was, kind of a mixed bag. I remember when that one came out. Like I was into some of the stuff. I was not as much into the stuff that really wasn't very metal, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, it began to obviously they were using it was, it started out as a very rock oriented thing and very metal oriented thing, but then, you know, the popularity of other styles of music began to uh, seep its way into the normal pop culture, and so then lots of things started crossing over.
So, saying that, we get around to 2002 with WWF Forcible Entry. So take a look at that list of bands on there and tell me what you think about that.
I mean, it's all when you look at the time period. I mean, it's all um, mostly new metal with a couple of hip hop acts and alternative metal. There's not a
Yeah,
lot of metalcore or anything like that. So it's definitely alternative metal and new metal.
yeah. So you got Drowning Pool, Kid Rock, Creed, Disturbed, Limp Bizkit, Our Lady Peace, Rob Zombie, Breaking Point, Marilyn Manson, The Union Underground, Seven Dust, Saliva, Monster Magnet, Stereo Mud, Neurotica, Cypress Hill, Dope, Boy Hits Car, and Finger 11. So you definitely know it's 2002. I mean, just listening these out.
Exactly.
Some of the big ones like The Game we mentioned earlier, Triple H, Young Girl Old from Creed. Kid Rock did a cover of Legs from ZZ Top. That was for Stacy Keebler, and I will never forget that. Um, God, she was hot, and she
And
was like, she was an awakening for me. I mean, I-
more ways than one.
so the SmackDown theme song at the time was "The Beautiful People" from Marilyn Manson, and the theme song was "Across the Nation" from the Union Underground. So I didn't know a lot of these bands. I mean, this was kind of getting out of my wheelhouse. I mean, we've talked about in the past that for me, I'm not as much of a new metal guy or even an alternative metal at the time. But I mean, I listened to this album a lot because I was riding with my sister. I mean, I was not driving age at this point, so she's a massive wrestling fan, and any wrestling album, we had all of them from the wrestling album all the way through. We had Full Metal, which was the second one that came out, which was not metal, but it was called Full Metal. It did have Scott Ian on there playing something. I can't remember what it was, but should have probably mentioned more of that. But I remember this one big time because it was like this was right in the pocket of, you know, my wrestling fandom really grew in the '90s. I was always a fan, like I said, as a kid, but like in the '90s, it was when I was more conscious of it. So 2002 was big time.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much at the point in which I checked out.
Yeah. But
I mean, I checked out, and what it was more, I had just gotten into a new relationship. I just got married, again, and I was paying attention to my life at that point, and so every so often I was home on a Monday night, because Monday night was a softball night. So if I was home, if I was off or whatever, I'd be flipping channels and I'd come across Raw, you know. So
so
uh,
every once in a while you had time for big sweaty men, but you're mostly focused on being married.
yes. No, it was mostly, well, yes, mostly focused on being married and playing softball. So, but it was one of those things where it was like I just I because WCW had gotten sold to WWF, I wasn't really too pleased with that.
Mm,
Um, you know,
fair enough, yeah.
the whole, you know, Shane McMahon buying WCW and Vince McMahon, it was just so weird to me, and I was just kind of thrown off by the whole
I mean,
thing.
I loved that. It was everything that followed that was bad. Like
Well,
the
yeah,
moment, the anticipation. Oh, I'm gonna finally get to see all these WCW guys fight WWE guys, and then oh man, they botched that one.
yeah. I mean, and that's part of the whole thing. Like, I there was some anticipation. I was definitely, looking forward to seeing what was going to happen. And yeah, it was a complete botch. And then it just came to the point where like, this is not what I was expecting. And I was just, yeah, whatever. So I checked out. But you know, like I said, every so often you would see a commercial on TV, or you would flip channels and you catch somebody. So I knew, it was, I knew, like I would catch a rock. So, the whole Attitude Era stuff was really cool and shit like that. And then, checking in and out. Yeah, I'd never followed it enough. And then in 2019, just by sheer chance, you and I were working one day, and I just had heard a rumor, or going into 2018, 2019, I heard a rumor about some guy was going to start, or some company was starting that was a wrestling company. And I had heard on January 1st that some company had started. That's all I heard. And then you go back and you see the clips from the press conference where all these new wrestlers were starting, and then they pull out Chris Jericho. It's like, whoa, Chris Jericho's a big name. And that's how I got hooked back into wrestling. And I haven't stopped watching AEW wrestling since that first episode of Dynamite in October of 2019. I've pretty much caught every single episode of Dynamite since then.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a good time to be a wrestling fan again.
Right now, it's an amazing time to be a wrestling fan. And, with all these pay-per-views and all these, theme songs, I think that's the one thing I wish would happen again. I mean, they do it, but they don't do it like they did before. Now it's kind of like
crap. Let's get some real metal back in wrestling. So one last album that we're gonna mention, 2006, and this list of artists is gonna sound very 2006. Saliva, Mercy Drive, Theory of Dead Man, Shadows Fall, Killswitch Engage, POD, Motorhead, and Drowning Pool. WWF Reckless Intent from 2006. Those bands definitely sound like that time period, but they're still around for the most part. I think Shadows Fall came back, right?
Yes, they reunited. They were working on an album. Killswitch Engage is doing an album soon. Saliva's still kind of together. Theory of Dead Man had some popularity, and they're just putting out albums, but they're in just touring, but they're nothing huge.
Well, POD was big for a time.
Yeah, they're back together. They're actually touring. I just saw them. They're coming to Houston soon. Obviously, Motorhead is no longer.
Of course.
Drowning Pool is back with their second, I can't say original singer because the original guy died, but their second singer. I
just want to mention one thing about, so one of the bands was not like the other. So Mercy Drive, they did this song for Randy Orton, which he always hated. They did like 3 or 4 versions trying to get something that he liked, and he just never liked it. And then he replaced it with his Voices theme song eventually. And they just kind of died to death after that. So they never really, got anything. And I think he was always nice about it. He was like, I thank them for the music and everything, like, but I hate it. And so it kind of like it never really got them over, to use wrestling terminology. So it's kind of a bummer.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to mention a few major WWF, WWE pay-per-view theme songs. Did you have any that you wanted to point out before I go into this?
No, just a lot of the same names come up over and over again.
But you, like you said, Drowning Pool like 158 times. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but yeah, it's not far.
Drowning Pool was used a bunch. Kid Rock was used a bunch. Alter Bridge was used a bunch. Seether a few times. Metallica, which is that's pretty cool. They're cool songs. that they use, and it's super cool that they have these theme songs, you
Mhm.
know, but somewhere along the way they don't use them like they used to, and I would it would be cool if they got back to doing stuff like that.
Oh yeah. So like one of the most memorable ones for me was WrestleMania X7, so 17. They had The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin, and they had one of the most killer promos of all time using My Way by Limp Bizkit. And I'll never forget that. Like I went to that pay-per-view. That was my first WrestleMania that I went to. And it's one of those that even though I'm not a big Limp Bizkit fan, like it's absolutely iconic in my memory. Um, so then SummerSlam, they used Bodies from Drowning Pool. I mean, that was SummerSlam 2001, I should say. That was like a huge song at that time. And it was such a huge song that they decided to use it again in 2005 for ECW One Night Stand, then again for ECW One Night Stand 2006, then again for ECW December to Dismember 2006, and I think it was even on some other stuff. So they just kept using that theme song.
Well, I mean,
Um,
there's nothing wrong with the theme song. I mean, I
it's
guess
awesome.
they were using mostly for ECW, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it became a thing, so that's fine. SummerSlam 2003. Go figure. They used Saint Anger by Metallica. I forgot about that one.
Well, that was we're gonna go ahead and license this because we're gonna promote the album because it just came out at that
Right.
point. I mean, look,
Two.
there's nothing wrong with it.
Sure. Uh, 2005, No Way Out. Enemy by Fozzy. So that was the first time they used the Fozzy song. That's pretty cool. That had to be, huge moment for Chris Jericho. Um, 2007, Unforgiven. They used Rise Today by Alter Bridge. Pretty great song. 2008, Your Boys Again, Metallica with All Nightmare Long.
A good
I
song.
that one. That one was cool. I remember watching that pay-per-view. Um, 2009, WrestleMania 25. I was there. It was in Houston. They used Shoot to Thrill and War Machine from AC/DC.
That's real. My favorite ACDC song.
And AC/DC was hitting kind of a renaissance again there because that was around the time they did the Iron Man movie and all that stuff started
Mhm.
really blossoming. So AC/DC, coming back strong. They did it the following year, Thunderstruck, with WrestleMania 26, and then even as recent as 2017, they used Fozzy with NXT Takeover Chicago. Used Judas, his theme song from AEW.
Interesting.
Uh, and then just this last year, War Games 2023, that was a Survivor Series. They used War Pigs from Black Sabbath. That was exciting to see because it was like a modern day pay per view. Because we're mostly talking about 2000s, right? So modern day pay per view 2023, they used Black Sabbath War Pigs. That was cool. Glad to hear
Modern
that.
day pay per view using an old school band.
Oh yeah. So just briefly wanted to mention Fozzy as well. I was a big fan of Fozzy. I did like them really for their first four albums. The stuff that came later, I wasn't as big into. It started to kind of veer away from the classic metal sound that they were kind of trying to emulate in their early days. And if you listen to their first album, it's mostly covers and a couple of original songs that he and Rich Ward wrote together. He being Chris Jericho, obviously. But they were covering, like Crocus, Dio, Twisted Sister, Iron Maiden, Motley Crue, stuff like that, right? And then their second album was mostly original content, but they did a lot of covers as well. They had Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Scorpions, Wasp, bands that we love. So as time went on, they really veered away from that. By their third album, it was all original music. I really love that album still today. The fourth album was really good too, Chasing the Grail, still in the same lane, but by the time they got to Sin and Bones, and that's the tattoo that Jericho has on his shoulder. That's a skull with like a saw blade and some wings. Um, that was when they really started to veer away from that kind of stuff, and it became more like modern hard rock and a lot, gearing towards what they're doing today with Judas. And I still haven't heard their newest album, Boombox, but they've done some really good stuff. And for a name like Fozzy, I think it sets them back. And there's the jokes and the goofy videos that have come out recently of Chris Jericho, on tours and stuff like that. And like people just lighten up, have fun, try to try to go enjoy things. And if you don't like it, like just don't see the show. But I think that's just kind of the thing. Like, yeah, we're a little bit too harsh on each other today, and some of that music is actually really good. So at least give the first few albums a chance if you are a classic metal fan.
Yeah, I mean, I like his stuff. I got into the covers. I mean, I did not get into Fozzy early on, so the whole hey, this band stole my music and I'm really the originator kind, that whole comical story. I wasn't into it and I didn't know about it and I
I
didn't
watched
learn.
it, but I wasn't into it either. I remember watching it on like MTV, I think it was, or maybe it was VH1, and just being like, that's kind of stupid, but I like the album.
Right. So I went back and, listened to some of the albums and the cover songs are pretty cool. I mean, I have them on my playlist. And I like some of the ones that they've done. A couple, they did a Twisted Sister song and it's like,
Yeah, it was Eat the Rich. No, I'm
no,
sorry, not Eat the Rich. Their Twisted Sister song was Stay Hungry.
yes, Stay Hungry. That's a really cool version that they do. And they've done Accept songs. They did Balls to the Wall. They've done Iron Maiden songs. I think like two or three of them. They did Motley Crue songs. They were cool versions, Scorpion songs, and then a couple of other times they do covers, and it's not, there's something about the sound of it is kind of off, but for the most part they do really really good covers, and then every so often you be like, this was not so good. But I'm a really big fan of the song Judas. I really like that song. So I'm happy for their success because it obviously continues to allow them to be able to do stuff. That's, it's what they want. Who don't come down on the guy for being able to pull off wrestling and being a singer. Is he the best singer in the world? No. Are they the best band in the world? They're pretty damn good, for what they do. They're entertaining. And that's what we want. We want entertainment. We want to be happy, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of come into the mindset recently of like, if you don't like something, just do something else.
Exactly. Move along. Get away.
All right, so two last things we're gonna go over before we get to our big four. We're gonna talk about Corey Taylor. You're a bigger fan of his than me. You like some Slipknot stuff, and I would say I'm more err on the side of Stone Sour if I'm gonna listen to Corey Taylor. But he's a big wrestling fan, so you want to talk about him for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, Corey, Corey's one of those guys. He's very polarizing, because he's very opinionated and he doesn't really give a shit. Um,
I
sounds
respect that about him. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you either love him or you hate him. And he is a big wrestling fan. He's a really big horror movie fan. He does those Comic Cons. He's been in, stuff like that. He's shown up in clips here and there. And obviously Slipknot is a blend of some kind of nightmare for somebody and really
Oh
interesting metal
God,
music.
nightmare.
So, Corey Taylor's one of those guys. It's, you love him or hate him, and he is a big wrestling fan, and he's appeared on Talk Is Jericho, the Chris Jericho podcast, and he's done a combination with Slipknot, combining with NXT, at the 2015 Aftershock Festival. There's just a lot of stuff. He owns a Ted DiBiase $1 million belt. That's pretty cool.
So
Big. Oh, go on.
bigger than that, he owns his own belt. So he has the CMFT belt, which is the Corey motherfucking Taylor belt,
Right.
which he had custom made for him for his album from 2020.
Yeah. I mean,
Technically, he didn't have it made for the album. He had it made, and then he was like, "I'm going to put this on the cover of my album."
that's cool. I mean, who else is going to go out there and make their own belt for themselves? Maybe me.
I
I
mean, I
might.
might.
I might do that if I had the money. I mean, big fan of NWA. Not the band, not the artist, but the wrestling alliance. National Wrestling Alliance, WCCW, World Class Championship Wrestling, and he's just Corey Taylor is a famous person, and yet he is just like you and I.
He's a pretty down to earth guy.
He is.
The thing you mentioned about the NXT appearance at the Aftershock Festival, what's cool about that is, so they kind of primed it up like the band had heat with NXT, because they were like, who's the headliner here? Like, we're the artists, we're the musicians, and you're just a wrestling organization. Well, in reality, he's friends with Baron Corbin. So they did a whole thing where Corey slapped him, and then it allowed Samoa Joe to pin him, and then Corey got to celebrate on the show. Well, that's kind of why, because he and Baron Corbin are actually friends. So
There you
that's
go.
pretty cool.
No, I mean, just being able to be involved that way is really cool. Sort of like how Scott Ian's involved in horror movies and being able to act and get done with makeup, and you don't even know it's him.
Yeah. So one other thing, like his solo track, Culture Head, was used as the theme for NXT TakeOver 31. And that was in 2020 as well. So that was from his first album, or first solo album. So, yeah, definitely a big wrestling fan in Corey Taylor. And then let's talk about the last thing before we get to the big four will be the WrestleMania kind of connection to metal, since we're going into WrestleMania weekend. It all starts with WrestleMania 2 with Ozzy Osbourne walking the British Bulldogs to the ring.
I remember that.
Him being a British metaler, walks the British
metaler.
Yeah. You've never heard that term before?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, it just means he's a metal guy, a metal musician. Alice Cooper. This one I remember. But I didn't see it at the time. I remember watching it on a VHS tape. It was Alice Cooper came out with Jake the Snake, and he actually handled Damien and scared the referee with him. So Damien was his big boa constrictor. So
I vaguely remember fights. I don't remember because it's WrestleMania 3. So I know I saw. I'm pretty sure I saw 1, and I'm pretty sure I saw 3. 2 is also. I'm pretty sure I saw those, but I don't remember how I saw those. And I remember I was at a friend's house for one of them. I can't, but the other ones, the first 3, there's something about me being involved in them somehow, watching them, that I remember distinct things about each one of those.
So my local, what do you call it? Blockbuster had like probably about 10 different wrestling tapes, and one of them was like WrestleMania 3. They had Halloween Havoc, probably like 90 or something like that. Like they had like very specific ones that I was so confused as a kid sometimes, because I just thought of it as wrestling. I didn't really think of it, like different organizations and stuff like that. So I just remember being like, why did I see this guy on this show and then he's not on, but he's on the other show now? Like, I was just a little confused about that. But I remember seeing that one, and I remember seeing Jake the Snake do the the one where he had the cobra and it bit Macho Man on the arm. And I remember like seeing that as this kid, and I was not really afraid of snakes, but I was like, I don't want anything to do with snakes. I'm good. All right, so Motorhead played at WrestleMania 17. They played Triple H out, and like I said earlier, I was there and got to see that. Drowning Pool and Saliva played at WrestleMania 18 in 2002. Motorhead played at WrestleMania 21 again in 2005. POD played at 22 in 2006. Kid Rock played at WrestleMania 25 in 2009. I was there as well. That was the only time I will ever see Kid Rock intentionally. Not intentionally, as I wanted to be at WrestleMania, but Living Color played Cult of Personality at WrestleMania 29 when CM Punk came out. That was really cool. I remember that one. Nita Strauss played at WrestleMania 34. She was one of the Iron Maidens for a while.
Yes, she was.
We've talked about that before. And then Joan Jett recently played in 2019 with the Blackhearts at WrestleMania 35. So, unfortunately, now we get a lot of different genres of music and live performances that I'm not as into. But as you can see, there's at least 10 performances or occurrences where a metal performer was on WrestleMania. So that's pretty cool.
That is very cool. All right, so right before we get into our big four, I got one last thing to say. We didn't mention this, and this is something that came out last year.
Okay.
But the Von Erich movie came out last year, talking about the family. And one song that plays prominently throughout was the theme song for Kerry Von Erich, and that was Rush's Tom Sawyer. Now, growing up, I did not realize, because I didn't see a lot of World Class Championship Wrestling, because it was mostly based out of Dallas, Texas, and I was living in New York for part of the time and in Miami for some of the other time. And it wasn't like World Class would play like on a Saturday at 3:00 on a bogus channel that I never saw.
Yeah.
So, or they usually actually play it sometimes on ESPN, like on a Thursday at 3 in the afternoon. So those were, so I never got to know that Kerry came out to Rush's Tom Sawyer. I thought that was pretty cool to find that out. I mean, if had I known that, shit, I love that song.
I always liked the Von Erichs. Kerry. My dad was a big fan of Kerry, and so when he was Texas Tornado in WWF, and just when he was Kerry Von Erich, I always liked him, partially just because my dad liked him. So
Right. Let me tell you, the Kerry Von Erich, just the whole story. I would love to get into doing a wrestling episode about that, but the fact that he wrestled with a prosthetic leg for several years,
prosthetic foot.
Still a prosthetic foot. I mean,
yeah. So the movie, if you've seen it, isn't 100% accurate.
No, I know it's not. I didn't see it, and
okay.
I'm not basing any information off of the fact that I saw it.
In the movie, they make it like most of his leg.
Oh,
it's like a full prosthetic leg, and I'm like, why change that?
Yeah, right. No, it was a foot, but regardless, the fact that he's wrestling with a prosthetic foot, and it's funny because I went back and I saw some videos, and you realize if you look at it, you can tell that something was off with his foot.
But he hit it really well.
Oh yeah, he hit it really well to the point where he was showering with his boots on.
Yep,
that's crazy. All right, so we're up to the big four. It's metal wrestling theme songs. It's our favorite four. So I'm going to go ahead and go first and let you finish it up and do the encore, because this is really an episode that you were really behind. And so I'm going to go first.
All right.
Give you my theme songs. All right. So my big four heavy metal wrestling theme songs. And you know what? Let's use the term heavy metal loosely with this because it's mostly just rock. Um, but number four, I have to put it in there just because it's a classic, if you want to put it that way. Real American from Rick Derringer and Hulk Hogan's theme song.
Like,
Um,
there's nothing wrong with that. I listen to it on my walk sometimes because it randomly plays in my playlist.
all right, now we get to some real rock music. Number three, Unscripted Violence from the Violent Idols, John Moxley's theme song. Uh, like I said, I wish he would go back to that song because it was so much better for especially for the character that he portrays on AEW. Number two, and I'm just disappointed that he's no longer with AEW, but Kingdom from Downstraight, Cody Rhodes' theme song. It's one of those things where you don't hear it anymore unless you're watching WWE. But it's pretty cool the fact that he's allowed to use it now in WWE as well. I think that was a really big thing for WWE to be able to do that. It's almost like they've grown up a little bit in the last couple of years.
Well, yeah, you get rid of the psychopath and go figure, things start running better.
Imagine. And number one for me, it's just Lemmy, man, Motorhead, the game, Triple H. That's my number one heavy metal theme song.
I think that's a pretty damn good list. Cody Rhodes Downstate, or Kingdom by Downstate. That's not my usual type of music, and maybe it's because I like the wrestler so much that I like it too. So I mean, it's not on my list, but it was pretty high up there, surprisingly. So my number four is a wrestler that when I was a kid, I did not like him. But as I became an adult and rewatched wrestling, because I went through basically the 1990 through the early 2000s, I was watching on the WWE Network back when that glorious thing was around, and unfortunately, we have the Peacock now.
Cockles.
Got to watch it on the cock. So it's such man that it was such a downgrade. But I really came to appreciate this wrestler. But I always loved his theme song, and that was Hitman, the Bret Hart's theme song from 1994. Not his original theme song, which I did like, but the re-recording that Jim Johnston did with the awesome guitar solo. That was metal. Love that one. You're going to see how much of a mark I am for a certain wrestler right now. My number three is King of Kings, Triple H's theme song from 2006 by Motorhead. The lyrics of that one, just badass. Bow down to the king on your knees, dog. Like, it's just badass. My number two is The Game, Triple H. Always one of my favorite wrestlers, and Motorhead just knocked it out of the park with these tracks. Love his other theme from Evolution as well, but that's my least favorite of the Motorhead ones. And then my number one was a wrestler that just was my absolute favorite for the longest time. Still love what he does today, but he hasn't wrestled in quite a long time. But I did get to see him a couple of years ago at his last appearance at WrestleMania. That was Stone Cold Steve Austin. I Won't Do What You Tell Me, his 1998 theme song. So his 1997 theme song was great, but 1998 was where they really shored it up. That was his best run. That was like probably my favorite time in wrestling was 1998. Now that, I mean, when I really think about it, it's at 1996 through 1999, probably the best time, but 1998 specifically. Just remember that with like DX was around, the NWO was still around, like doing their thing, and it was before it got really bad. Sting was the Crow character then. Stone Cold really blew up. The Rock was finally showing up, and he was becoming the Rock. Like, 1998 was amazing. So, love that time period. And Stone Cold, I think, his music was just what really blew me away.
Oh, I like your list. I like it. I like it. I'm not as familiar with those Motorhead songs as I am with the game or with King of Kings.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like it. I mean, who Stone Cold is a little metalhead himself, so that's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's our big four metal wrestling theme songs, and that is the end of this episode of Debating Metal. Remember, you can listen to us just about every week on your favorite podcast platform, and if you want to see us grow, don't forget to click like or subscribe, and also tell your friends about us so they can also click like and subscribe so that they can check us out on a regular basis too.
And don't forget you can interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and our new X account, or send us an email at debatingmetal@gmail.com. YouTube viewers, click subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when we post the new show. And remember to tune in to the next episode where we'll spark up another exciting metal debate. On behalf of Kenneth and myself, stay safe and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.